All right. Subsequent to Larry's research, I asked my Office of Management and Planning to dig into our data and look back over the last several years and see what that data described or indicated was going on in the city of Milwaukee with domestic violence as it related to the arrests. One of the things that stimulated my thinking is I'm certainly not the only chief executive who takes an elevator upstairs to work every day, but what struck me is that every time I was on the elevator early in the morning, I would have 3 or 4 officers fresh from court. I'm talking like 9:01. I'm like, what's up, guys? Oh, yeah, my case got dismissed, my case got dismissed, my case got, oh, what'd you have? DV, 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 DV. Every day of the week, I'm getting on the elevator with police officers who've got their mandatory 3 hours overtime, and their case has been dismissed in the first 5 or 10 minutes of court because the victim didn't appear. That's telling us something. There are a lot of professions in which we pay great attention to our clients and their desires. In domestic violence, we don't. When we're at a call, we're there to arrest somebody. And notwithstanding the fact that the person that called us may plead with us not to make the arrest, we're going to make the arrest. All right? Larry's research indicates some questions that we might think of, but let's see what its effect is overall. All right, this is the big picture of domestic violence in America. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men have experienced some form of serious physical violence. Although we've made a lot of progress, and we have. I mean, we know a lot more about it than we did. Certainly no one can say we're ignoring the issue. The state of practice, the state of societal thought, the state of criminal justice thought about this issue is far different than it was when I was a baby police officer in Jersey City, okay? We know a lot, we do a lot. There are advocates, there are resources there weren't, there are places to go, there are services to get. None of that existed, and it's fair to say one of the outcomes of these laws was to focus societal attention on this problem. America has a great habit of focusing societal attention by arresting people, okay? But what this did do, I believe, is develop an entire array of services that simply didn't exist before the Minneapolis experiment. All right, this is the definition of domestic violence under Wisconsin state statute. It's any intentional infliction of physical pain and injury, et cetera. And these, spouse, former spouse, an adult with whom the person resides or formerly resided, or within whom the person has a child in combat, a large net. Okay, domestic violence, simple assaults is what we're primarily talking about, okay? If I have a domestic violence aggravated assault, that's a no-brainer. Whether I had a mandatory arrest policy or not, somebody's going to jail. All right, you've got a broken arm, you've been beaten to a pulp, you've been stabbed. Whoever did it's going to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. But it's domestic violence, simple assault that is really the biggest part of this issue for us in terms of responses, and that's the change. Any other simple assault in the city of Milwaukee, we don't make an arrest. All right, unless there's real, just short of ag assault, okay? We refer people to court. We send people on their way. If we made arrests for every allegation of he shoved me in our entertainment districts, we wouldn't do anything else. We would have nothing but jails full of drunken college students. All right? This is the one place, no exception. That's the rule. He did what to you? You're under arrest. Okay, what do we see here? Well, so far this year, we've had over 1,100 simple assaults. Almost 3/4 of them were domestic violence. Now, we know that because there's reports about the domestic. Maybe there's other ones no reports were made of, but of the reported simple assaults, we've got nearly just over 70% of them were the DV assaults. Now, overall, simple assaults declined from 2012 to 2013. DV-related simple assaults increased slightly. We've seen a decrease in domestic violence, simple assaults in the last 6 years, but that tracks with a general decrease in crime we'll see. Okay, homicides. Last year, regrettably, was the first year we've had over 100 homicides since the year before I got there. I thought I was doing so well. Consistent with national trends, the majority of our homicides arise from disputes. Argument, fight is the biggest single category of homicide in Milwaukee. And they are stupid Facebook fights that somebody brings a gun to, Twitter fights, mean mugging fights, dirty look fights, didn't apologize profusely enough for bumping into me. I mean, in some segments of the community, it's almost normative that deadly violence is a socially approved way to maintain status in the community for a perceived insult. It's a problem. And with our wacky gun laws in Wisconsin, yes, I said wacky gun laws in Wisconsin, we're arming heavily a significant segment of the community. Okay, family violence, child abuse contributed somewhat to the increase. So far this year, there have been 20 homicides, well, as of last weekend, 24. And it's the lowest rate we've had in 10 years, but I have no confidence in that remaining, so not after last weekend. Okay, 2013, we had a spike in domestic violence homicides. Took us by surprise. You'll see that it's been in a fairly consistent range of 7 to 11 over the last 8 years. Okay, victimization data, always important. As you can see, 13 of our 100 or so homicides last year were domestic violence related. That was 12%. 62% of our DV homicides were killed, victims were killed with a firearm. Over half of the victims had prior arrest by MPD. As you can see, 62% of our homicide victims were African American, 23% Hispanic, 15% Caucasian. 6 were male and 7 were female. And this is an interesting piece of data that we stumbled over. The logic of mandatory arrests has always been it's going to prevent the escalation of violence that results in homicide. Anecdotally, we thought this was true, but then we found a number to back us up. As you can see, almost 70% of our victims had no prior victimization reported to the police department. All right? So the vast majority of our DV homicide victims have not had the police in their house arresting anybody. Only 1 victim had repeated victimization that involved battery. All right, over the course of 8 years, we decided to dig back into the data. What did we see? 81 DV victims over the course of 8 years. 75% African American, 14% Caucasian, 9% Hispanic, 2% Asian. Almost 60% had no prior victimization listed with the MPD. Almost 60% had prior arrest by the police department, and just over half the victims were male. 53% male, 47% female victims of domestic violence homicide. Less than a quarter of those victims had 1 or more batteries reported to the MPD. Suspect data. There were 81 DV homicide suspects. The descriptors, as you would expect, the suspect descriptions generally match the victim descriptions in most violent crimes, as they do in domestic violence. As you can see, nearly 3/4 had at least 1 prior arrest before the homicide by the Milwaukee Police Department. All right, we've got a lot of partnerships out there. All right, many of these partnerships didn't exist, years ago. But the District Attorney's Office is a very strong domestic violence advocacy program. There's a community domestic abuse advocacy program. Homicide Review Commission, the Sojourner Family Peace Center is a very close partner of ours. We have a program I just referred to, the Community Domestic Abuse Advocacy Program. We have DV advocates in our police district station houses that we can refer people to, victims to immediately. The advocates respond following police intervention and provide victim and/or abuser services. As you can see, we have dramatically increased our referrals engagements as we've expanded this program just in the last 3 years. We're doing a lot of intervening and a lot of offering of services to victims of domestic violence. Now, the interesting thing here is you look at our misdemeanor battery DV arrests and all domestic abuse arrests. The thing that strikes me is how consistent they are over time. All right? If arrest as the macro attempt to abate or lower this problem is one crime category that, despite a consistent number of arrests from year to year, remains remarkably stable in our city. And I think, as you'll see, so far this year we've already made 1,100 arrests for domestic abuse-related offenses. And as you can see, over the last several years, very consistent. Every year, we're piling 3,000 people into the system, arrested generally for simple assault, domestic violence. Now, misdemeanor battery DV and misdemeanor battery DV arrests. Once again, you see consistency in arrests. There has been a gradual diminution of misdemeanor DV batteries, but that seems to be following general crime trends more than directly related to the number of arrests we're making every year. Oops, what happened to that? Why isn't that working? It's blank. Rats. Okay, let's go back here. Imagine that there are numbers in that chart, which I happily have in front of me. But, you know, interesting issue here is the following. When there's a lot of talk, and there is a lot of talk, I'm going tomorrow night, there is a panel being hosted by the public radio station in Milwaukee. They did a 6-part series looking at the demographics of who's in prison. And of course, what they note is the, compared to the base population of Wisconsin, obviously, a great disparity along the lines of race as to who's in prison. And so that's the subject of tomorrow night's symposium. Well, let me add to that, all right? Domestic violence, person involvement by race, by percentage. Okay, between 2007 and 2013, black victims of domestic violence of all our cases, 72%, 74%, 74%, 74%, 74%, 75%, 75%. Black arrestees, the same time period, 73%, 75%, 74%, 76%, 75%, 75%, and 77%. The overwhelming majority of arrestees and victims of domestic violence between 2007 and 2013 were African American. There are many different ways to look at that from a sociological perspective, from an economic perspective, but what is as a result, as a practical matter with the police department and its community, we're putting more black men in jail, all right? And overwhelmingly, the victims of those offenses do not prosecute. Now, believe me, I've been around in the business a long time. I know there are going to be arguments made that people don't prosecute out of fear, that there's concern about repeated violence, that charges are dropped. I'm not pretending that hiding in those numbers aren't serious cases. But something is being told to us as well when it's persistent for so many years that such a high majority of our victims don't want to see jail as the solution to the issues they have at home. And we know there's other issues besides the straight-up abuse. Where was I? Okay, so the question for us as we look at the stability of our arrest rates over time is whether or not, arrest for misdemeanor battery has an effect on overall crime reduction. Whether or not it makes a difference in the lives of that particular couple, if from the big picture arrest was going to have an impact on this particular social problem, one would expect more variation in the number of arrests that need to be made. But those numbers change very little. We know there are unanticipated negative outcomes associated with arrest that have been documented. Challenge is having the conversation. And we cannot, forget or gainsay the fact that there were reasons these laws swept the country. This historical moment was right. There were a lot of concerns about domestic violence. And my experience with law changes, stories tend to defeat data when it comes to changing law, and there were horrific stories, many of which had found their way into court systems with great publicity about the system grossly failing chronically, seriously abused women, okay? That reality can't be forgotten as we step back and look at the longitudinal impacts of this law on the people affected by it. And the reason I say that is because the instant reaction of the advocacy community, who are our partners, is rejection. Okay, when the story came out in my paper about the London presentation we made, I mean, there wasn't even a moment's like, well, we'll really have to look at that. It was, you're wrong, this is bad. You can't abandon women like this. It is wrong to think this isn't a serious crime. It's wrong. The headline was they debunked 25-year-old data, they called it, which really wasn't. But there was no On the other hand, well, let's look at this. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's a visceral concern. The alternative isn't doing nothing, okay? Questioning these assumptions is not saying, so we suggest going back to 1975 responses to domestic violence incidents. Nobody is saying that. Nobody would say that responsibly, okay? We know intrafamilial violence has terrible outcomes for everybody. We know the literature on children exposed to violence. We know the violent backgrounds that result in child abuse as well as spousal abuse. We know what happens to how many of our more violent offenders started out abused or neglected or witnesses to ongoing family violence. We are much more mature about it societally almost everywhere except in the criminal justice system, in which you're under arrest, social problem, you're under arrest. All right, we're great. In fact, I have learned, when you think about it, there is not a single significant social problem society hasn't pretty much turfed to the criminal justice system right now. Biggest mental health facility in your state is the prison. What do we do with substance abusers? Arrest them. What do we do with the chronically mentally ill who are on the streets? We end up arresting them. What do we do with the chronic substance abusers? Arrest them. And if there's a social problem that needs to be addressed, America's advice is more training for the police. Okay? So that's a problem for us. I mean, sadly, American society has kind of taken a step back from a lot of significant issues. That's not what we practitioners should be placed in the position of seeming to advocate. The challenge for us, to build on Jim's remarks and on Larry's, is how do we say, okay, is the criminal justice system the optimal way to deal with simple assault, domestic violence? Define the problem narrowly, not repeat violent assaults, all right? Simple assaults. I've had this circumstance, and every chief has had, when two married people who are both police officers inevitably come back from the cop party having had too much to drink, and who gets accused of flirting with who? Now, both of them have been trained in defensive tactics, I might add, all right? And things get out of hand. The neighbors call the police show up and arrest both of them, and now I have two of them in my office afraid of losing their jobs and their incomes because things got out of hand that night. No allegations, no history, no injuries, all right? Sometimes dumb things happen among couples. Is the absolute forbidding discretion in this single part of the law the best way to do it? What we've learned in the police industry, you need to articulate policies and publish and train to them in everything. We've got policies about a lot of things. We tell people what to do in specific circumstances. And I would offer, if the data keeps getting replicated the way it is, perhaps the solution isn't to say, okay, we're going to retreat from using arrest as a sanction in domestic violence, to rather developing policies based on the evidence to say, when in doubt, under this set of circumstances, lean this way. When in doubt, in this set of circumstances, do that. Under these circumstances, you shall. Under these circumstances, you may. We do that with virtually every other form of misconduct or problem we encounter, given the research that has taken place, given the array of services available now, given the social awareness of the problem now. I'd like to think we've matured enough to get to a similar place. But I offer this strong caveat. We need to move gingerly, and we need to honor the fear and loathing that will come initially from the advocacy community as they confront the notion of a retreat from mandatory arrest policies, as they perceive that as a retreat from the issue, which it manifestly is not. And just one last point. Questioning long-held assumptions is always risky. In public life, it's usually safer to maintain the status quo than to risk implementing change. Failing conventionally is always the safest option, right? Just apply the conventional solution, and if you fail, everybody will say, well, he did the thing. And you can say, well, I increased patrols. I did whatever you're supposed to do in these things. So that's our challenge. The question for practitioners and researchers is whether or not actually reducing the harms associated with domestic violence is worth the risk of questioning assumptions about it. And that's the challenge for us today and going forward in the future. Thank you.